Hello, it's just David here with my weekly message. Well, I know you're all glued to your television sets at the moment for the Tour de France, and I thought that no year would be complete without some sort of commentary on what's going on. Actually, a few years ago, I did run a study day, which one or two people went to. Not a huge amount, it must be said. I suppose a limited clientele. Thinking trying to think theologically about the Tour of France. But as you're watching this video, I thought I would just kind of share some thoughts with you. So I'm kind of assuming you know the Tour de France is a bicycle race and therefore of interest to me. So it's a 3-week, what's called a Grand Tour, roughly around France, 21 stages, and all the world's top professional riders go into it. And I thought I'd just pick out sort of one or two themes which kind of bear theological reflection. And I suppose the first one of them, obviously it's a huge adventure. It's incredibly difficult, supposed to be one of the most difficult endurance events in the world. But that idea of quest, I was just sort of thinking about, the medieval knight of the medieval ideal of the sort of the noble knight, the Christian knight on a quest, if you like. It's sort of satirized in the Monty Python's The Holy Grail. But that idea of quest, which seems to have kind of gone out of fashion in Christianity, and kind of understandingly so, it's rather sort of militaristic. But nonetheless, I think that idea of quest and goal. And then alongside that is that need for suffering. And that suffering producing endurance, which is what, of course, Paul says in his letter to Romans, chapter 5. Not only are we boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance. And of course, that's something that cyclists do all the time. It's you boast about how much you suffer, how much, how difficult that climb was, how difficult that stage was. And the idea is by that repeated suffering, you produce the endurance that enables you to do a race like that. And I suppose that does sort of colour what we think about suffering. I mean, obviously suffering in the Tour de France, or just a amateur level of cycling, is very different from other sorts of suffering, mainly because it's sort of self-imposed. Now, of course, sometimes, if you had a bad accident or something, it can have worse repercussions. But basically, yeah, you kind of chosen to do it, however much it's costs you, which is rather different, of course, from a lot of other forms of suffering. And so Paul talks quite a lot about he uses athletic metaphors, running the race that's set before me in order to win the crown. But that idea that, it is about kind of somehow getting used to suffering and that producing endurance with us, and that enabling us to kind of get to the end of this quest, which, if you like, we might call life, I think is something that has resonance in the sort of in Christian theology. And I want to pick up a couple of other things, really. One of them is the relationship that you get in Christianity between law and what you might call the written laws and the sort of oral laws, and then the great commandments to love. The interesting thing about cycling is, like all sports, and particularly one that's sort of technical as cycling, there's huge long rule books. I mean, they sometimes make fun of them. Apparently there's a special ruler which measures the length of riders' socks, and if their socks are sort of 2 centimeters too long, they get fined and things like this. So there's enormous amounts of sort of written rules, and sometimes the interesting thing is sometimes they're bent, sometimes they're not enforced. There is a huge amount of leeway, and also there's also strange enough, there's a lot of other rules which aren't written anywhere, but that the sort of unwritten rules of cycling that everybody just obeys anyway. So I mean, the classic example is that on the penultimate stage, um, that decides the winner. So the last stage is what's called a sprint stage into Paris. But actually, for the first bit of that, the winner with his team will, take glasses of champagne and rise along and pose to the cameras. Now, theoretically, somebody will say, oh, look, quick while I pay, we'll ride off. But you'd never do it because it's just one of those unwritten rules. And there's quite a lot like that. And I think there is this interesting dynamic in cycling. I mean, there's in other sports as well, but this idea of what sporting and what sportsmanship is about, that yes, you might obey the written rules to the letter, but actually what's sporting behaviour? What's the spirit of the law, if you like? I suppose that's Christians think about quite a lot as well, don't we? That, what's the, we try not to be tied down too much to the letter of the law, but what's the spirit of it? What's it there for? What's it trying to achieve? So I think that's sort of an interesting reflection. And one of the reasons in cycling, and it's true to a certain extent in other sports, but it's particularly in the way that cycling works, is also about loyalty. And I'll talk in a moment about teams and how they work. But the interesting thing about cycling is it's a relatively small pool of people. And I don't quite know how many there are. But there's about 20 professional teams in the Tour de France. There's a few more each that don't get in at sort of various levels. Each of them have, 15, 20, 25 riders. And, it's a pretty small world, really, particularly compared to other sports. Because that, I'm talking about men's cycling here. Women's cycling is even smaller. And the contracts are very short. They're renewed 2 years. 3 years is fairly unusual. 1 year is not impossible. And one of the things that produces, and it's why it's rather a nice sport generally, is it produces loyalty to what's called loyalty to the peloton, which is the sort of name for the sort of big group of cyclists. In other words, if you act in a really unsporting manner, chances are in 2 years' time, the person that you really hacked off by doing that, you'll be on their team. And so actually, because teams change around so much, there's a kind of incentive to say, well, actually, the loyalty towards the whole thing is more important. I mean, obviously, loyalty to the team, you work as a team, and so I'll talk about that in a minute. And you want your team to win. But I think more than other sports, there's actually a kind of loyalty to the sport that's wider than that. As I say, it's partly just to do with sort of contractual arrangements. But I wonder also then, how that affects sort of loyalty in the church. And of course, again, like the church, cycling has been hit by scandals, particularly scandal with sort of doping and things. And in the church, we've been hit by our scandals as well, very regrettably. And so there comes that, question of loyalty, what are you being loyal to? You're being loyal to the team or to yourself or to the sport or some ideal of the sport. So I think that question of loyalty and how that loyalty can be misplaced, as it was in the church, people forgot, ultimately where their loyalties should lie, and that's always regrettable. And of course, it happens in other parts of life as well. But I think that's another thing that's worth reflecting on. And then the final one is one of the sort of keys to understanding a Tour de France, and I could obviously do lots of videos about this because it's quite a hard watch. I understand that. I was talking to this about somebody the other day that it looks. I mean, it's got some fantastic scenery, which kind of rescues it, but it looks, in a sense, quite boring. You see lots of men in lycra cycling along and grimacing, and indeed women as well. There's a women's Tour de France this year as well, which is great. But as somebody once described it, it is chess on wheels. Why do people go and watch chess? It's not fantastic, fast-moving, all action, but people will still go and watch a sort of top chess match or maybe snooker or whatever because of the kind of tactics and the intrigue. And the trouble is, unless you understand them, if you're just a sort of Martian looking at chess, you'd think, well, goodness me, why does anybody ever watch this? Or even snooker or something. But once you get the kind of the personalities and the tactics, and somebody described, cycling as chess on wheels, and it's quite a good description of it. So that's a long way of saying that actually what people don't understand is this relationship between individuals and teams, because it's a sport in which individuals win. I know there are team awards, but then they don't really make the news. I mean, what people are after is individual awards. Now, again, it's slightly more complicated because we know of the individual who wins the yellow jersey. Perhaps you might have heard of that. You might have heard of sort of Bradley Williams, Chris Froome. But there's other ways to win as well. There's actually sort of 4 jerseys which are given out, and then also winning each stage is in itself an enormous thing. But the thing about all those winners is they're individuals, individual riders, and yet they're competing as teams. And so there's this real dichotomy in it. Is an individual sport like sort of tennis, or is it a team sport like football? And the answer is it's somewhere in between, because I say there is only an individual winner, but actually it's the team that supports that person to get there. And I suppose that's something that the Christians think about. I mean, one of the sort of arguable results of the Reformation was that Protestant Christianity often made the individual think about themselves. I mean, actually, it's not particularly. I mean, actually, Catholic spirituality often does that as well. But kind of, what is Christianity about? I mean, is it about getting me to heaven in that slightly individualistic sense? What must I do to be saved? Is the scriptural question I must do. Or is it something a bit more like a team? What is it that makes the church? What should the church be like? How is it to be in the body of Christ? That sort of language. Is the important thing the team together, or is it actually me and God and actually the team? Well, it's nice to have around, it's a bit of fellowship, but really ultimately it's not terribly important. And as I say, perhaps the church is a bit of that hybrid, because in a sense where you can only be responsible for oneself and one's own relationships with God, but we are part of a team as well. We are part of a church, and sometimes Christianity would be easier if we could just do it on our own, but actually we can't. We do it in relationship with other people. And I suppose that is a bit like cycling, that actually once you get into the tactics, you get this idea that actually I'm there to kind of do my job. It's a sport in which there's an individual winner and there are individual goals that people are aiming for, but actually you can only do that within a team. And also therefore the idea of sort of sacrifice for the team. So actually, in a cycling team, and not everybody can go for personal goals, because actually there are maybe 2 or 3 leaders in the team going for various goals, but actually the other sort of 4 or 5 riders are there to support them. Actually, they have to put aside their personal goals. So there's a bit of a kind of theme of self-sacrifice there in order to support those people who are going for one of those individual prizes. So that's just another thing to think about. So, as I say, just a few sort of ramblings, really, because, as I say, the Tour de France is just, by the time this probably, you see it probably just coming to an end. But just some of those things about, suffering, about written and unwritten rules, about the idea of a quest, and about the relationship between the team and the individual. As I say, just a few ramblings, hopefully something to think about.